We've had kind of an excursus the last couple of weeks talking about how people in the early days of the world understood God. We talked a little bit about that last week. This week we're going to talk about some of the Old Testament places of worship. When you realize who God is, I think it's a normal, natural, right response to want to worship. Knowing how to do that may be different than wanting to do that, though. So we'll just look at several things from the Old Testament this morning. Of course, we'll end up in the New Testament talking about how the first century Christians perceived worship of God. If you start back at the beginning, what kind of worship was going on in the Garden of Eden? We don't have any indications of worship settings. We just have Adam and Eve. We have God walking in the garden in the cool of the evening, so we assume that maybe he had done that before, and that they had a relationship that was more mutual and discussion-based, that they had conversations with God, but we don't have much to go on as far as what the worship would have been. The word worship itself, in the Greek, is proskuneo. It means to fall down at somebody's feet, to prostrate yourself in front of someone. Did Adam and Eve assume a posture of any kind when God came into the garden? The first time we have any record of how they responded to God coming, they had already sinned and they were hiding in the bushes. So there was a sense in which his otherness was there. They were afraid of the disconnect that had happened when they ate the fruit. But prior to that, we really don't have anything to go on. When you get to Cain and Abel, all of a sudden sacrifice is there. Cain brings the sacrifice from the field, and Abel brings the sacrifice from the flocks. Both of them make sacrifices to God. There's nothing in the text to tell us why. What was it about God? What was it about their relationship with God that made them think that burning something on an altar was the right answer to the question? Now, you and I have been raised differently, obviously, several thousand years later. But has that ever been something that came to your mind to do? Did you ever think, what I really need to do is kill an animal or get some wheat or grain from the field and burn it in an effort to worship God? But Cain and Abel, that was the first indication we have that people knew that there was a God to be worshipped, and how they tried to do that. They made sacrifices, and that kind of worship stays all the way through the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Right? There's some place that this group of people, this lineage of people, is always building an altar and worshiping God. Then you get to kind of the patriarchal period in the Old Testament, where the heads of households, usually almost exclusively men, were making sacrifices not just on their own behalf, like Cain and Abel, but on behalf of the whole family. If you would, turn over to Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1. This is the part of Job we know. First 2 or 3 chapters and the last 2 or 3 chapters, all that stuff in the middle where Job and his friends are discussing theology is a little more difficult for most of us to deal with. Think about Abraham. He probably lived somewhere in the same time frame as Job, maybe a little bit after Job. Job chapter 1, beginning in verse 4. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes on their birthdays, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each one of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. So a birthday was a big celebration, followed by a time of purification, and the head of the family, Job, making sacrifices on behalf of the rest of the family. Now, it'd just be a ballpark guess, but maybe around 2500 BC is what we're talking about. So the heads of the households, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob did the same things. There's not as much indication of huge groups of people coming together for a sacrifice, but family groups, the heads of the family groups, would bring their families together for purification rituals and for making sacrifices on their behalf. It's interesting to think about what Job considered to be sin. What is it that his children might have done that might have been considered sinful? It's listed, maybe they had cursed God in their hearts, but maybe they have sinned in some other way. There's no law yet. So what is it that Job considers to be worthy of making a sacrifice? Again, we don't know. We finally get through Egypt and we get out into the desert years. Moses leads the people out into the desert, and God calls on them to build a tabernacle. Go over to Exodus chapter 40. Exodus chapter 40, beginning in verse 30. Exodus 40, and verse 30. We're starting in the middle of a long list of things that Moses did to prepare for worship. But he placed the basin between the tent of meeting and the altar. He put water in it for washing. Moses and Aaron and his sons used it to wash their hands and their feet. They washed whenever they entered the tent of meeting or approached the altar, as the Lord commanded Moses. Then Moses set up the courtyard around the tabernacle altar, and he put up the curtain at the entrance to the courtyard. And so Moses finished the work, that is, the work of setting up the tabernacle in the wilderness. The cloud then covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day that it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during all of their travels. During this time, the Israelites took on a new way of setting up camp. They had 3 of the tribes on the north, 3 on the south, 3 on the west, 3 on the east, all camped facing inward toward the tabernacle. So in the middle of the night, if you looked out, there would be a pillar of fire where the tabernacle was. The presence of God being understood to be in the tabernacle. So if you want to worship God, where is God? He's in the tabernacle. So all of those people, they would not have assumed that for them to go out, outside of the camp, out in the boonies somewhere, that's where God would be. If they wanted to be where God was, they would come back to camp. They would come back to the place of the tabernacle. I was taken aback to read that Moses could not enter because of the presence of the Lord. Mark brought up in class this morning about how Moses goes up on the mountain and is with the Lord, and when he comes back down, he's so bright and shining, they have to put a veil on the guy. So he's been in the presence of God. He's been right there with the Creator. But when God's presence descended on the tent of meeting or on the tabernacle, even Moses couldn't approach. So the vast, amazing presence of God was there. Well, outside of the tabernacle, of course, was a place to make sacrifices. So people would come there to be where God was and to make sacrifices to the God that lived there. In fact, they believed that he lived between the cherubim. The Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, that's where God was. When they broke camp, they were very, very careful about how they handled the Ark, how they handled all of the implements of sacrifice and washing from the court, the 7 golden lamp, the lampstand, the showbread table, all of those things. They were very, very careful about how they used those, how they transported those, because to them, it represented the absolute presence of God. Roll forward to the time of David. David had an absolutely beautiful palace. And he was interested in finding a way to honor the God who had honored him so much. You think about all that God did for David in his growing up years. He is called in from the field. Samuel has already looked at all of his brothers, and they've all been turned down. And God says, that's the one I want. And he chooses David. Not the biggest, strongest specimen, just the guy after God's own heart. And he blesses David to give him first the kingdom of Judah, then the combined kingdom of Judah and Israel together. He unites the entire kingdom of God's people, and God just keeps blessing him. Sometimes he gets it right, sometimes he messes it up, but he always has this special relationship with God. And so he looks at his palace and he says, you know, I would like to build a place for God. And God says, I'm sorry, your hands are full of blood. You're not the guy I want to build my temple. But if you want to plan it out, if you want to get materials together, all of that's fine. But we're going to leave the building of the temple to your son. So eventually, around 900 BC or so, Solomon comes to power, and he builds a building that's roughly twice the size of the tabernacle, mostly for more storage. Right? It's very centralized. The priests are going to have to travel and stay there for a period of time while they're ministering at the temple. And so there's a lot more storage facility built into the temple than there was in the tabernacle. It's much more ornate, much more permanent. There's a lot of gold involved. There's a lot of cedar involved. It's one of the things that David did before he died. He got hold of Lebanon and had them bring in a bunch of cedar from Lebanon. I don't know whether Lebanon still has those kind of forests or not. They may have been ancient and eradicated by now. But in those days, if you wanted cedar, you wanted to get hold of the folks in Lebanon. So he brought lots and lots of cedar down to build that temple. I don't know about you, but if there's a big building that's full of gold and the smell of cedar, I think that would be fabulous. It would be an amazing place to go to experience the presence of God. So now things shift. No longer do you go to the place where the tabernacle is. At this time it was probably at Shiloh. But you go to Jerusalem. So not only is the temple the place where God is, but Jerusalem is the city where God is. In fact, God says, I have chosen Jerusalem. Right? That's my spot. So people would travel from all over. All the Jews who could would make the trip all the way to the temple. It was huge. It was ornate. It was amazing. David and his songwriters wrote songs about what it's like to go to the temple. And they wrote songs called Songs of Ascent, meaning songs that we sing while we're going up. And so as they were approaching Jerusalem, you could see at the top of Jerusalem. Think now where the Dome of the Rock is. In that general vicinity is where the temple's at. So if you're coming up from those valleys that surround Jerusalem, all these people are coming up the sides of the hills to get to Jerusalem. And you can see the temple up there on the high place, up in the beautiful place. And they're singing these songs about how wonderful it is to come into the presence of the Lord. That temple lasted about 380 years, give or take. In 586 BC, it was destroyed by the Babylonians. They carried off a whole bunch of the Israelites, and they carried off a lot of the treasures from the temple as well. When you read in Daniel, you can see that they were having a feast, and that they were using things that had belonged to the temple to make toasts and celebrate to a false god. They were in exile in Babylon for about 50 to 70 years. And then they were allowed to come back to Jerusalem. When they came back to Jerusalem, they first cleared the area. They got the foundation cleared off from where it had been destroyed. And then they just didn't do very much more. They set about the business of reestablishing industry and building their own houses and putting things together for themselves. But there was a sense in which God was returning, but it seemed like he was returning gradually back to Jerusalem. Look over at Haggai, Haggai. It's the third from the end of the Old Testament. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Right after Zephaniah. Look at chapter 1, verse 1. Here's the message that Haggai received from the Lord. In the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jozadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but you're not warm. You earn wages, only to put them into a purse that has holes in it. So Haggai's message is this. There's something missing in your world. Pay attention. A modern writer has said there's a God-sized hole in all of us. Haggai was reminding the people of Jerusalem, there's a big God-sized hole in your lives right now. You keep trying to make it without God. God is trying to call your attention back to himself. You started the process of rebuilding his temple, and then you stopped. When the people got around to rebuilding the temple, there were two different responses. The people who had lived in Jerusalem prior to the exile, by this time, they were older people, seniors. They looked at the temple and they cried. They said, it's just not the temple we remember. And the young people celebrated because they finally had a place for God to live among them again. They didn't know what had been lost. They didn't see the lack between before Babylon and after Babylon. This one lasted around 600 years until the Romans destroyed it in 70 A.D. There was one interruption in there. There was a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes. He was one of the generals for Alexander the Great. And there was a lot of political intrigue and goings back and forth. But basically, about 150 years before Jesus, troops came into Jerusalem. They destroyed parts of the temple. They sacrificed pigs on the altar to basically run God out of town. They put in rules. You could no longer keep the Sabbath. You could no longer circumcise your children. So to be Jewish and to be a practicing Jew in the presence of God went out the window. There was a man known as Judas Maccabees. And if you look in the Catholic Old Testament anyway, there are 1st and 2nd Maccabees that tells the story of the priests and of the Maccabees who waged wars. It was a guerrilla warfare. Think about how new and different it seemed when the United States was breaking away from Great Britain and we didn't line up in lines and shoot. We were shooting from behind trees, that kind of guerrilla warfare. It's way older than that, all the way back at least to the Maccabees. They waged a guerrilla war against the Greek armies and eventually ran them out of Jerusalem, rededicated the temple. So when Jesus is on the planet, where does Jesus go to be in the presence of God? Jerusalem. Kind of a trick question, isn't it? He was always in the presence of God, but he went to Jerusalem. He and his disciples went to the temple. When he goes to the temple courts and he throws over the tables and he runs the animals out, what does he say? My Father's house is to be a house of prayer, but you've turned it into a place of commerce, a den of robbers. Jesus says, the temple. That's the place. That's where God is. That's where you come to make sacrifices. Jesus made sacrifices. Is that not weird? The ultimate sacrifice, making a sacrifice to his Father. Paying for his disciples. Everybody had to pay. Everybody had to make their sacrifices. Celebrating the Passover lamb. Can you imagine that? Just the night before he's arrested and taken to the cross, he's eating the Passover lamb with his disciples to commemorate this sacrifice that Israel made so that God saved them from Egypt and brought them out into the wilderness. All of that symbolism, all of that beauty that's built into God's plan. But it was built around all these sacrifices. And the sacrifice was typically made in the place where they felt like God was living and God was seen as living in Jerusalem at the temple. Well, somewhere around 30 A.D., in Samaria, we run into that woman at the well. And the woman at the well is a beautiful passage. If you haven't read it recently, go to John 4 and just read all of that. But I just want to pick apart toward the end of the conversation. John chapter 4, beginning in verse, well, we want to highlight 23, but I think we want more than that. John 4, let's start at 19. 19. Sir, the woman said, I can see that you're a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. There was a great divide in that generation. They were on Mount Gerizim. There was a temple on Mount Gerizim to God. It happened just after Solomon's reign that the northern 10 tribes broke away from the southern kingdom. And they didn't want people traveling to Jerusalem, which was the capital of the southern kingdom, to worship. So they built places for them to worship in the north. Eventually that turned into worship of Baal and Asherah. Jezebel's big problem with God was that she financed and helped support all of the priests of Baal and Asherah. So she says, we think we can worship here. Can't we worship here on this mountain? Why do you think we have to go to Jerusalem? Why is it such a big deal for us to go to Jerusalem? And then very famous passage in verse 23. Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. But a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. She says, I know that the Messiah, called the Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. And Jesus said, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. So here's a place in which Jesus kind of separates. You know, we're not talking about Gerizim. We're not talking about God being in that spot. We're not talking about Jerusalem. We're not talking about God being in that spot. We're talking about people entering into a spiritual relationship with God, in which they worship him in spirit, not in physical things. Of course, after his death and resurrection, there was no more reason for ongoing sacrifices. So you could go all the way back to Cain and Abel and the things that they were doing and the things they were doing as the head of households and the things they did in the tabernacle and in both temples. They become obsolete. The Hebrew writer tells us how the blood of bulls and goats can never take away sin. That's why God sent his one-of-a-kind Son, so that he could take away our sins. So we worship through him, in him, a Father in spirit, not in physical activity. Look at Hebrews chapter 10, verse 22. Hebrews chapter 10, beginning in verse 22. You can go into a lot of discussion about right worship. In class this morning we were bantering a little bit about pattern theology, about the idea of, getting a list of do's and don'ts, and this is how you worship, and this is where you worship, and when you worship, and all that kind of thing. But the Hebrew writer is interested in one main piece of the puzzle. Chapter 10, beginning in verse 22. It says, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we can spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. So, in contrast to Cain and Abel, who came and just worshiped basically for themselves. And in contrast to Job, who came to worship on behalf of his family, or the Israelites who worshiped on behalf of Israel or on behalf of their families, the Hebrew writer says, let us come together and encourage each other. So come one, come all. Everybody into this avenue of worship. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. The one who promised is faithful. And let's consider how we can spur each other on toward love and good deeds. What's the best part about our worship besides being in the presence of God? I mean, that's obviously the thing, right? We come together as a group so that together we can enter the presence of God. We do that in a place, but hopefully we do it in spirit and in truth. But what's the thing beside that? It's the each other part of our get-together. When we join together in worship of the Father as a group, we have the opportunity to remind each other of a couple of things. Number one, there are more like me. I have this faith. I'm trying to live out this faith. Oh, look, there's somebody else that's like me. We have visitors this morning that sought out a place to be with like-minded people. We don't know the folks where they worship. We might know one or two. They don't know the folks where they're worshiping this morning. But they wanted to be here because this was a place kind of designated by signage that, they would be comfortable joining with us in being in worship. So the Hebrew writer says, don't stop getting together in groups, because as you get together in groups, you have the opportunity to encourage each other. You may not say anything to encourage, but just being there encourages. Just descending to the same place at the same time with the same intention, with the same motive, brings us together in worship. So all through history, people have worshiped in different places for different reasons, in different ways. But worship is something that we should never allow to get very far from our hearts and from our minds. To be called to it relentlessly, constantly, and in the opportunity to worship God. Hope that is encouraging to you today. If there's some way that we can help you, if there's public response that you need to share with us, we'd love to do that as we stand and sing.
I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided.